Good morning, Year 11. I want you to start by having a look at this image, and it's a picture by William Hogarth titled Gin Alley, and I want you to think about what does this picture suggest to you about life in the 18th century London. Look at it really closely. So just a little bit of background information. William Hogarth was an English painter. His work ranged from realistic portraits to comic strip-like series of pictures known as modern moral subjects. Hogarth was born in London into a poor middle-class family. Okay, so think about the image. It's entitled Gin Alley, and what does this picture suggest to you about 18th century life in London? Okay, so I'm going to read the poem for the first time, and I just want you to try and get a bit of an understanding about what it is about. So it's called London. I wandered through each charted street, near where the charted Thames does flow. A mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear, how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn's infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Okay, so who is or was William Blake? So William Blake was a painter, poet and printmaker, and he's considered an influential figure in the visual arts of the Romantic Age, so similar to Percy Shelley, who we were looking at yesterday. And the Romantic Age was an artistic, literary and musical movement that encouraged freedom of expression, love, respect for the nature, the arts, etc. He wrote most of his works during this time, often rebelling against oppressive institutions like the church, the monarchy, or any and all cultural traditions, sexist, racist, classist, which stifled imagination or passion. So William Blake and Percy Shelley, they'd have been best mates, loved each other. So what was happening at the time? So Blake was a huge supporter of the French Revolution in 1789, when the French people revolted against the monarchy and the aristocracy, using violence and murder to overthrow those that were in power. Many saw the French Revolution as inspirational, a model for how ordinary disadvantaged people could seize power. Blake alludes to the revolution in London, arguable suggestions that the experience of living there could encourage a revolution on the streets of the capital. So it said perhaps William Blake was trying to incite this sort of revolution through this poem. So why? So London appears in a collection called Songs of Innocence and Experience. Published in 1794, this collection of poems aimed to show the two contrary states of the human soul. The Songs of Innocence section contains poems which are positive in tone and celebrate love, childhood and nature. The Songs of Experience, which is obviously where this poem comes from, are obviously intended to provide a contrast and illustrate the effects of modern life on people and nature. Dangerous industrial conditions, child labour, prostitution and poverty are just some of the topics that William Blake explores. So let's read again with our new knowledge and see if that affects the way that we read the poem. So London, I wander through each charted street, near where the charted Thames does flow. A mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear, how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So did the knowledge of the context now help you understand and interpret the poem more successfully? So what is London about? So essentially the poem depicts the dark underbelly of the 18th century London. Whilst the city was a growing metropolis, it did have a huge dark side, the spreading of sexual diseases from prostitutes, enforced child labour, people dying, and the institution of marriage had turned into something that was frankly shambolic. So I want you to think about how that might link to the themes of power and conflict. So Quick checkpoint, 3 questions. 1. What was Blake suggesting about life in London through his poem London? 2. Some may argue that Blake was inspired by what political event when writing his poem London? And 3. How does London link to the theme of power and conflict? So let's have a look at the poem and some annotations. Okay, so a few things that I've picked out that I think were particularly interested. So just to remind you, the poem presents a negative view of London and its inhabitants. The wealthy and the powerful live lives of luxury, while the poor live a life of misery and oppression. And I know I just said that Shelley and Blake would get along, but I think Dickens would have been, you know, in the mix as well. It's very A Christmas Carol this. So all your information about Christmas Carol is really going to help you out with this assignment. So Blake guides the reader through the streets of London, exposing the suffering of the people. He uses the repetition of marks to emphasise their suffering, marks of weakness, marks of woe, so woe meaning sadness. So the repetition of marks emphasises the suffering of the people of London. You've got the semantic field of suffering that's going through, which highlights that everyone in the city is affected, and it runs all the way through the poem. You've got weakness, woe, cry, fear, another cry, sigh, tear or tear, depending on pronunciation. So everybody is affected by this suffering in London. And we've got this really emotive metaphor here, and it runs in blood down the palace walls, which creates this dramatic and critical tone. But is this William Blake trying to create a revolution? Is this William Blake trying to incite what was going on in France at the time? He wants the people of London to rise up against their circumstances and rise up against the rich and wealthy who keep them there while they live in comparative luxury. We've got this juxtaposition here, the youthful harlot's curse. So a harlot is effectively a prostitute. So the youthful harlot, so against the newborn infant, suggests the corruption of infants. So if you're a youthful harlot, if you're a youthful prostitute, and against the newborn infant, it's saying that these people are not victims of their circumstance. They are forced into these lives of servitude because of the situation they're born into, not because that's what they want to do. So you've got the juxtaposition there that's really important. And finally, this plosive alliterative verbs here: blast the newborn's infant's tear and blight with plagues the marriage hearse. So these plosive alliterative verbs imply violence, and again, is this Blake inciting a revolution? Okay, so on here, I'm just going to run through a basic overview of this whole poem. So London is taken from the Songs of Experience poetry collection by William Blake, and it reflects his anger regarding the oppressive institutions like the church and the monarchy and all cultural traditions, sexist, racist, classist, which stifled imagination or passion. We've got the repetition of marks of weakness, marks of woe, which creates this melancholy and sad tone. Sadness and defeat are etched on the face of the Londoners. Would it be possible to say these marks have been mapped on their faces, just like the chartered streets and Thames have been mapped? Everything, even sadness, as a result of oppression, is controlled. We move on to the quote, "I wander through every chartered street." Blake immediately begins his poem by criticising the lack of freedom those in London are forced to endure. The adjective chartered suggests everything has been mapped, everything in this place has been chartered and must submit to this charter, even the natural River Thames. The repetition of chartered reinforces control. Blake's use of the verb wander implies he is misguided in this strict city. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban. Blake's use of anaphora, which is the repetition of in every, highlights the prevalence of the horror the speaker describes. It is a thudding and oppressive and reflects the suffocating atmosphere of the city. The repetition of every shows that no one can escape the cruel and brutal regime of London. Even the youth of the city are forced to suffer a cyclical nature of miserable existence. The mind-forged manacles, this metaphor, he's criticising the people of London here, saying that they are victims of this harsh existence, but they also do it to themselves. They allow themselves to exist in that. They're not rising up against it. So they believe they're condemned to misery and do nothing to help themselves, which is clearly a criticism of religion at the time. The word manacles, which is like chains, implies restrictions and imprisonment. The people of London are imprisoned by their own lack of belief that they can live differently. The fact that they are mind forged shows they are more powerful than physical manacles could ever be. The chimney sweeper's cry. So the cry of the chimney sweep and the sigh of the soldier become the soot of the walls of the church and the blood on the palace walls. Likewise, institutions of power, the clergy and the government are rendered by mention of the places in which they reside. So basically, again, it's him trying to create this revolution. The lack of faith in change is the source of frustration for Blake. He alludes to a possible revolution in London, suggesting that the horrible experience of living there could encourage a rebellion on the streets of the capital. Blake was a huge supporter of the French Revolution, when the French people revolted against the monarchy and the aristocracy, using violence and murder to overthrow those in power. Perhaps Blake saw the French Revolution as a model for how ordinary disadvantaged people could seize power. The chimney sweeper's cry as well links back to the mind forged manacles. It could also be Blake's attempt at creating a subliminal message, because the third stanza has been formed as an acrostic poem with the first letter of each line spelling out the word here. So it's is he telling the reader to listen out for corruption wherever they are? The youthful harlot's curse, the newborn infant's tear. Blake's final lines or verse deals with the consequences of the mind-forged manacles. The cycle of misery recommences in the form of new human being beginning their life. Born to a cursing prostitute, the baby is immediately condemned to join a life of misery and oppression. So now I need you to go to Sentry and complete your nugget on this poem.